The Russian language is one of the most widely spoken languages on our planet. And what is especially interesting is that Russia is the keeper of 150 more languages. Of course, that would be hard to even imagine that all its peoples from west to east would speak one same language, the language of Tolstoy and Dostoevsky. No, there is much more to that. Today, I'm going to tell you more about some of those languages of Russia, about which little is known. Before we go directly to the examples, let's look at a general overview of languages in Russia. It must be remembered that it is fairly hard to calculate their exact number. One of the reasons to that is the endless debate among linguists about what we should understand by a language and what by a dialect. There is a so-called list of languages of Russia and their vitality, developed by the Russian Academy of Sciences, according to which for 2022 the list of living languages of Russia includes 155 languages. The status of which of them, of course, varies. Languages are marked with different indications, for example, these ones. It really is an interesting document. Do have a look at it with an online translator. I've left a link in this video description. So speaking about this official list, it should be also mentioned here that it contains some examples of languages that some linguists consider to be dialects. Thereby, the document may look to some not very credible. We will look at one example of this very soon. Therefore, let's make a little conclusion here. There are a number of languages whose status has not been resolved yet, let's call it so, in linguistics. But anyways, we understand now that the number of languages spoken in Russia will vary within 100 and something. The diversity of the peoples inhabiting this territory is fairly amazing. To further imagine all the linguistic diversity of Russia, let's see what language families represent the languages of its peoples. And of course, this is not a complete list at all, but only examples of the most common ones. And I will say right away, so later you don't tell me in the comments and why you didn't tell us anything about this language, why you didn't pick up that one. There is absolutely no special reason why I decided to show you these specific languages in this video. Well, just because they seemed to me the most interesting ones. If you'd like to learn more about any specific language or languages, write in the comments and probably I will make a separate video on that topic. So let's start perhaps with the language that is considered to be the second most widely spoken language in Russia, one of the descendants of the Old Turkic language, the Tatar language. Its predecessor, the Old Tatar language, had its roots in the literary language of the Golden Horde, where Arabic graphics were used. During the period of the Khanate of Kazan, the Old Tatar language became widespread among the Turkic peoples of the Volga region and the Urals. After the conquest of Kazan by the troops of Ivan the Terrible, a new stage in the development of the Tatar language began under the influence of the Russian state. Thus, the Tatar language was formed in close communication with others, related and unrelated languages. It experienced a certain impact of Finno-Ugric languages and also Arabic, Persian, Russian. Tatar has a really long history of writing. Its people had long been introduced to writing, and so by the middle of the 19th century, it had gained a wealth of written experience. we can briefly view and analyze the history of the Tatar language development as follows. The Tatar literary language had been developing on a runic and Arabic basis for a long time, which allowed it to acquire extensive written experience by the middle of the 19th century. Since just that time, the design, so to speak, of the modern Tatar national language has begun to take shape. The beginning of newspaper publishing in the language after the 1905 revolution gave a serious push to the development of the Tatar language and the formation of its literary norm. Two of the three dialects were mainly used. The middle one, it is also called Kazan dialect, native to most Tatars of the Republic of Tatarstan, and the western one. As for the third dialect, it is called Oriental. It is sometimes distinguished as a separate Siberian Tatar language, which has caused quite a lot of controversy. Siberian Tatar is a dialect of the Tatar language, some say. Siberian Tatar is a separate language, says the Russian Academy of Sciences in their list, which we talked about at the beginning of this mini-film. Siberian Tatar is presented just as a separate language, although its speakers, Siberian Tatars, consider themselves representatives of a single Tatar people. By the way, I have recently visited Tatarstan myself. This was my first trip to Kazan, the capital of the Republic. To be honest, I was quite surprised that the Tatar language, as it seemed to me personally, is quite well spread and used here. Streets, metro stations, some signs, parts of billboards, menus of some cafes are in two languages, Russian and Tatar. There were even places where something was not duplicated in Russian, which I, as a native Russian speaker, did not understand at all. I mean, if there is a text in Tatar in front of me, or I listen to the speech in the language, I will not understand anything at all. And as you might have noticed, nowadays the Tatar language is represented with Cyrillic. Plus, of course, it has some special additional letters. But this was not always the case. We have already talked about the runic script, then the Arabic alphabet, which was used until 1927. In the late 20s of the same century, the language switched to the Latin alphabet, and only 10 years later, another reform took place. The Tatar language adopted the Cyrillic alphabet, which it uses to this day. Of course, such changes, and even in such a short time for a language, could not but undermine the literacy level of the Tatars themselves. Once the literate Tatar population and their literacy rates reached, according to some linguists, almost 90%, after the mentioned reforms had to go through, to some extent, cultural gap between generations. So what is happening to the language in the Republic now? Well, as I have already mentioned, the Tatar language is quite well spoken. It can be heard on the streets, but in most cases it comes from older generation. I will not say that I did not hear any Tatar-speaking people of the younger generation. No, I have seen younger couples speaking the language while staying in Kazan, but still Russian dominates. Yes, perhaps this is due to the place itself. Kazan is a very large city, as they say, the third capital of Russia. Things might be different in rural areas. It is worth noting, going back a little into history again, that in the 1930s, interest in the national language began to fade in Tatarstan, primarily in urban environments and settlements with mixed Russian Tatar population. The prestige of Tatar as a native language began to decline. Moreover, if until 2018 the two official languages of the Republic, Russian and Tatar, were studied equally at school, now the studying of Tatar has ceased to be mandatory. Russian is used for preparation for the exams, since admission to universities and education there are also carried in Russian. If that's something good or bad is not the topic of this video, the discussion of which, in my opinion, can go on for hours. Today, newspapers in the language are published in Tatarstan, despite the fact that their number has been falling over the years. There are production in Tatar in theaters, they produce cartoons in the language, including miniseries designed for children to learn the language. However, Tatar is classified as a vulnerable language by UNESCO. Let's turn now to another family of languages spoken in Russia, namely the Uralic family. Let's take a closer look at one interesting language in the group of Finno-Ugric languages, Mari, the official language of the Republic of Mari El, located in the Volga region. Unfortunately, the history of this fascinating language is little known. The only thing that researchers tell us with confidence is that the Mari language was formed just right here in this territory, the Volga region. But something is still known, of course, so let's have a look now at what exactly. Researchers are of the opinion that the Mari people might have been using runic, ideographic and Arabic writing. Interestingly, they had been using various geometric signs since ancient times, the so-called tamgas or tishte, which they used to carve on the bark or on special wooden sticks. As it is known today, each family had its own tribal sign, tamga. It represented first of all those activities that were characteristic to those family members. Tamga was also very often embroidered on shirts. But how and when exactly did the Mari language get on paper? It happened in the 17th century, thanks to this Danish scientist and traveler. Traveling through Muscovy, the name of the Tsardom of Russia of that time, he also met with the Mari people and wrote down some of their words. Upon returning home, the traveler published them in the book Northern and Eastern Tartary, which also contained the Mari text of the Lord's Prayer. This prayer translation is considered the first text in the Mari language. In 1775, the first Mari language grammar was finally published under the title Works belonging to the grammar of the Cheremish language, from the old name of the Mari people, Cheremis. The author of the book is considered to be the Archbishop of Kazan. The grammar used the Russian alphabet of that time with the addition of some letters. There was a dictionary placed, including about 1,000 words belonging to various Mari dialects. This grammar book began, let's call it, book publishing in the Mari language, as it let the normalization and establishment of the Mari grammar and vocabulary take first steps. In the second half of the 19th century, the Mari written language got its further development. Preparations were finally made to start publishing translations of religious books, dictionaries and ABC books were compiled and published. Later we can see the appearance of the first periodical in the Mari language. It is said to be the annual Marla calendar, published from 1907 to 1913 and aimed mainly at peasants. The pages contained information about the change of seasons and days, about the sun and moon, and how to write letters and other correspondence. But the main content was stories about society. What is also worth mentioning is that the writing of the Mari people is still developing in two versions. Hill Murray, spoken mainly on the right upper bank of the Volga River, and Meadow Murray, distributed exclusively on the Meadow shore. It is said that the Meadow and Hill Murray people feel like a single ethnic group, although they have slightly different alphabets. Currently, Hill and Meadow Murray, the literary Murray languages, use the writing system based on the Russian alphabet. As in Tatarstan, this year I managed to visit the land of the Murray language, and namely its capital, Yoshkar-Ola. Compared to Tatar, the Murray language is slightly less visible, again as it seemed to me, but it remains to be present. The streets are also duplicated in two languages, Russian and Murray. What pleasantly surprised me was that passing by the theater and then walking in the park, you could see the signboards of theatrical productions, of which, let's say, half, as far as I remember, were in Murray. That is, the theater does a lot of productions in the language, which is undoubtedly a good sign. By the way, just on the day I stayed in Yoshkar-Ola, I was lucky enough to see such a mini concert from the Radio Murray L, where they sang songs in their native language. You could see closer Murray folklores. In short, that was pretty interesting. Today, the Murray language is taught as a subject at schools and at some faculties of the State Murray University. Murray might be seen in some newspapers, magazines and books, and even if their number is very limited, there is some hope left that the Murray people and those who are interested in the language will continue to help Murray to be published in the form of, for example, such books, as well as to introduce their children to the language, the land of which is actually unique, with its strong pre-Christian traditions and the preserved cult of sacred nature. The next language we're taking belongs to the same language family as Tatar, the Turkic language family. However, the difference between that one and the Chuvash language is that Chuvash is the only living language of the Ugric branch, one of the two main branches of the Turkic languages. In general, linguists did not immediately come to the recognition that Chuvash has Turkic roots. The Chuvash language, like its people, is very unique. Ethnically, they do not really resemble Turks. Early researchers considered agriculture to be the main occupation of the Chuvash. They inhabited forest zone rather than steppes. Also, the Chuvash did not belong to either Muslim nor Christian world, professing a special religion of their own, similar to the religions of their neighbors in the Middle Volga region, the Murray and Udmurts. Because of these characteristic features, the first ethnographers and linguists working in the 18th century considered the Chuvash people and their language to be part of the forest and pagan world of the Finno-Ugric people. This German Orientalist was the first to suggest the Turkic origin of the Chuvash language in 1828. This assumption was proved in 1841 by his compatriot Wilhelm Schott. Interestingly, the Chuvash did not have writing as such in the old days, or say artifacts were never found. This is how the saying of "the cow ate the Chuvash book" came up. Let me explain. The saying was presumably formed due to this legend. God was once given books to people. One Tatar and one Russian got them, but the Chuvash was late to get it, so later he found out his book was eaten by a cow. Researchers believe that under the context of The Cow Ate the Chuvash book, military conflicts, for example, are hidden. Chuvash people, as some believe, once had a written language, but in the course of historical events, wars, disasters, they lost it. All this influenced the disappearance of the Chuvash script. In the 18th century, the Chuvash script partially used Latin graphics. It was in it that the first dictionary, or better say, a word list of the Chuvash language was written, published in 1728 by this Swedish geographer. In 1871, a new Chuvash script was developed by the Chuvash educator Ivan Yakovlev, who created a new Chuvash alphabet based on Cyrillic. Until about the middle of the 20th century, the Chuvash language was well preserved, which was facilitated by the low degree of urbanization of the Chuvash territories. In the 60s and 80s, when a large percentage of the Chuvash population moved to cities, the situation deteriorated significantly. During those years, there was a negative attitude towards the Chuvash language as a village language in society. Many parents preferred not to pass it on to their children so as not to spoil their Russian language. As for today, the modern Chuvash alphabet contains 37 letters. All the letters of the Russian alphabet plus 4 special ones. On the one hand, the Chuvash language of nowadays is the language spoken of hundreds of thousands of people. It can be heard, even though very limitedly, on TV or radio, and has a status of a state language in the whole subject of the Russian Federation. But on the other hand, this legislative status of the Chuvash language does not accurately reflect its true status. Despite being taught at school, the Chuvash language is not learned in a sufficient way. Urban children rarely acquire the language. There is a widespread positive attitude towards the language, but it is mainly seen as a symbol of cultural heritage rather than means of daily communication. There are some ethno-music bands performing in the Chuvash language and several films and the like, but their number is really low. And as we again look at the UNESCO classification of endangered languages, Chuvash is classified as vulnerable. Before we go to another fascinating language, let me remind you to like this video if you're enjoying it, and subscribe, of course. Here we talk not only about languages, but also we pick up such topics as language learning in general and world literature. If you want to support Language Easy and see new releases more often and in better quality, follow the link down below. And also don't forget about my online shop. Everything you see there is 100% made by me. Thank you. Well, now the Buryat language, the language of the Republic of Buryatia, the place that I personally would love to visit one day. The language of the Buryats, who, by the way, used to be called Buryat Mongols, belongs to the Mongolic language family. Its development is often considered by researchers to be independent and even isolated. Archaeological and folklore finds indicate that the Mongolian-speaking tribes, which later became the first Proto-Buryat tribes, migrated to the Baikal region in the 10th, 11th centuries. Since the end of the 17th century, they had been using the classical Mongolian script. Their language of the late 17th and early 19th century has the conditional name of the Old Buryat language. One of the first major literary monuments in the language is thought to be this book, Travel Notes. 1905 marked the creation of the so-called Vaigindra script based on the Old Mongolian script. However, it did not become popular, and at the same time, Buryat writing based on the Latin alphabet was starting to be experimented. In 1926, official scientific work began in the USSR on Latinized writing for the Buryat language, which was adopted only in 1930. In 1939, however, it was replaced by Cyrillic script with the addition of 3 other letters. Long-term and extensive contact with the Russian population, as well as the addition of specific Russian words into the Buryat language, had a great influence on it. Literature in the Buryat language began to develop after the October Revolution and included plays, short stories, and poems on social and political topics. Previously, the Buryats had translated Buddhist literature and historical chronicles telling about the origin of the Buryat tribes and important historical events. Today, the Buryat language in Russia is in a difficult situation. A significant part of Buryat native speakers are losing it, and each new generation can speak it worse and worse. To a much lesser extent, it is used at work or in school. The language is used in theatrical art, music, but the minimization of book publishing and media in the Buryat language is both a consequence and a reason for the loss of the language by native speakers. So UNESCO identifies Buryat as a definitely endangered language. Now we're moving to Yakutia, or the Sakha Republic, where we will look at another language representing Turkic language family, the Yakut language. Yakut is one of the oldest Turkic languages, which stands quite apart from its sister languages. Some linguists and researchers claim that the Yakut language was the first to separate from its common ancestor, the Proto-Turkic language. Its history begins in ancient times, probably about 2000 years ago, when people left the steppes of Central Asia to explore the northern territories. The Sakha people, having separated from other Turkic peoples before anyone else, reached the Lena River and along the way came into contact with Mongolian and other related tribes. As a result, the Yakut language has undergone significant changes in the phonetic appearance of many common Turkic words, and a large number of words of Mongolian origin have appeared. The first Yakut alphabet was compiled by the author of the first scientific work devoted to the Yakut language. This 3-volume book was published in 1851 and marked the beginning of the Yakut script. In addition to the usual Cyrillic letters, this alphabet included some others. It was used until 1920. Textbooks, newspapers, and fiction were printed in it. Speaking of it, it is worth mentioning this series of Yakut heroic epics, recognized by UNESCO as a masterpiece of the intangible cultural heritage of humankind. Today, the Yakut language uses the Cyrillic script, which contains the entire Russian alphabet, plus some additional letters. The Yakut language might be seen in works related poetic genres, short stories, novellas, children's fiction, less often novels. There is also translated literature. The language of nowadays is used much more often when communicating with family and friends, rather than in the official sphere. Nevertheless, the Yakuts are characterized by a relatively high and stable level of preservation of their native language. This is partially due to the fact that the Yakut population mainly inhabits rural areas. The role of Yakut as a traditional language of inter-ethnic communication throughout the northeast of Siberia is also significant. Now, UNESCO Atlas of the World's Languages in Danger classifies Yakut as vulnerable. Where will we further move on the map of Russia in search of other peculiar languages that exist on its territory? I propose we move to the North Caucasus and look at the Republic of Adyghe, whose native language has the same interest and name, the Adyghe language. Among other languages of the Caucasus, Adyghe is often called to be the most exotic. It is less like the rest of the languages, and it is evident in both grammar and phonetics. The reason for that is that the Adyghe language is polysynthetic, which means that unusually long words can be found in the language, such as these, for example. In the Adyghe language, one word can be considered a whole phrase or sentence because it contains a lot of information and meanings. Adyghe morphology has a rich inventory of prefixes and suffixes for verbal improvisation. This is especially reflected in written speech. In oral, as a rule, simpler constructions are used. Throughout the language history, there have been several attempts to develop the Adyghe script based on Arabic, then Latin, then Cyrillic basis. And since 1938, the Cyrillic script has been used for writing, which was created by the Soviet linguist Yakovlev. Compared with Russian, the Adyghe language is poorly used. And even though several newspapers are published in the language, its insufficient teaching and language transfer to children do their job. I think it's totally worth mentioning too. Many works of fiction have been written in the language, including these examples. Still, nowadays the Adyghe language, as we can see, is classified as definitely endangered. And finally, for the last part, I decided to leave the most exotic, in my opinion, especially for a European observer, language, the language of indigenous people of the far northeast of Asia, the Chukchi language, which is part of the Chukotko-Kamchatkan language family. What fascinates me personally about this very interesting language is one specific feature. It's that women and men speak differently. One of its distinctive details is the difference of pronunciation of specific words. The linguist Michael Dunn describes in detail two variants of the Chukchi language, masculine and feminine. But apart from the language itself, in this case, I guess its speakers can also seem to us unusual in a good sense and unique people. We cannot live without mentioning this man too, who made an attempt to create a separate Chukchi script. During one of his expeditions, he discovered and then described samples of pictographic records of the Chukchi language. The author of this pictographic script was the Chukchi shepherd Teneville. Earlier examples of such writing are unknown. Until his death in 1944, Teneville perfected his writing, but it never actually found use outside his family. As far as it is officially known, the Chukchi language has existed with its written form since 1931. The writing of the Chukchi language originally existed on Latin basis, from which Then they switched to Cyrillic in 1937, just like other peoples during that time in the USSR. It took quite a few years for a language to fully settle down, so to speak, and get used to the new writing system. Even in the 60s and 70s, some new characters were still being added to the alphabet until finally the Chukchi alphabet took its final form. This is what it looks like now. Since writing came to the language relatively recently, we will not see any numerous written monuments, but we will still be able to take a look at several and the most important ones. For example, the first book in the Chukchi language is said to be this one, published in 1932. But what about nowadays? Well, Russian is spoken by the absolute majority of Chukchi. However, as some researchers claim, in the tundra and other remote villages, there is still, even though extremely small, percentage of people who do not speak Russian. But as a rule, those are people of over 70 years old. The Chukchi language is used as a means of communication between the older generation, over 50 or even 60 years old. In some families, language transmission to children is still preserved, but it's more likely an exception of the rules. In rare cases, during hunting of a sea animal, old hunters exchange comments in the Chukchi language. However, due to the ignorance of the language by many young hunters, all the main commands are pronounced in Russian. Communication in the Chukchi language among younger generation is rather an exception. The youngest speakers of the Chukchi language are said to be of 30, 35, 40 years old. They most often do not see the need to be able to speak the language. Therefore, they do not usually teach their children the language. Today, some newspapers are published in the Chukchi language, or even some social, political, and fiction literature, both translated and original. Nevertheless, talking about the literary form of the Chukchi language is still quite early. It remains in the process of formation. The rules of spelling in the language still need to be clarified and improved. Evidently, the task of making the Chukchi language alive and not letting it die out, just like any other language we've talked about today, is a serious and important task. As for the Chukchi language, nowadays it is classified to be definitely endangered by UNESCO. As I've said at the beginning of this mini-film, there are so many more languages that can be found in Russia apart from Russian itself. Today we've seen only a tiny part of it, but I hope you found it worth watching and learned something new. If it's so, I'll appreciate very much your good comment down below, your like to this video of course, and I'll be happy to see you here once again, so subscribe. Thank you for watching. Till the next time.